Dr. Ron Daniels, the one and only.
I don't know about all that. But,
well, let me properly welcome you with an applause.
Yes, definitely. Yes. As always, Dr. Ron, man, thanks for calling, and I want to give you a round of applause for the State of the Black World Conference in Newark. I'm always humbled to be around so much knowledge, man, and it was a great conference, brother. It was a real great conference, and I hope we can move forward from that. And I thank you for allowing Black Westchester and allowing blacks in law enforcement, and allowing myself to be a part of the process and a part of the conference.
And well, we're profoundly thankful that you could play a part in it. We could not have had it and would not have had it without the participation of blacks in law enforcement and, of course, Black Westchester and the role that you play in the Pan-African Unity Dialogue. So all of that collectively contributed to an amazing conference, one which may well be historic in its nature. Certainly there are a number of people who are calling it that, and we're literally now pressing to get the declaration of intent and call to action out, as well as to post on the website the collective resolutions and recommendations from the various sessions, and also to give people the information about how they can get the videos from the conference. It's something like about 35 hours of archival video of everything, all the different sessions, which was, truly amazing. The connectivity, the culture of collaboration, the feeling, and the concreteness of which people were exchanging ideas about what to do. So it wasn't a gripe session, you know what I mean? It was, obviously people know what time it is in relationship to the white nationalists who have occupied the White House. But beyond that, I mean, people were down to how do we, in fact, help to build our communities, including the kind of work that was talked about in the criminal justice session about the kind of police restructuring,
right?
Figuring out ways and means to get community control of the police. I mean, so these were concrete things. It wasn't just flapping gums, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah. It was beautiful, and sometimes, man, I get in awe. Because when you see like people like Dr. Karanga, and when you're young and you're coming up and you read his books and you watch him, and then you see the brother right there in front of you and talking, man, my wife said, "Yo, she said, you turning into a groupie." I said, "Nah." I said, "Nah. You just gotta, when you sit and you know the sacrifices of even you, Ron, know the sacrifices, and you're sitting next to brothers like that, man, of course you got to get a little excited, man, because it's like, yo, this dude created Kwanzaa. This dude changed the mindset of black people, not just in America, but all over the world, in giving an alternative, to Christmas, and recognizing what we need to do for our own people. So yeah, you get kind of, you get kind of groupie-ish and excited, but it's a good feeling, because you get to see, elders, man, that sacrifice, that sacrifice for our people, man, and it's always a great feeling, and to enjoy that they're still here on Earth.
That's just properly just acknowledging the kind of contributions that people have made. But the other thing, as Randy Weston, our elder, the brilliant Afrocentric musician, pointed out, he was so excited because he had the opportunity to interact with people across 3-4 generations,
right,
including young people in their teens and their 30s, and others, or leaders in their 40s, and so he was really. He was really excited about that because he had not had that kind of total cross-generational experience.
That's right.
Before. So it was. The real work begins now in terms of the follow-up, and we're trying to build for that. We have to build our capacity as the Institute of the Black World 21st Century. We're relatively small. There were people who pledged that they would be supportive. We think there's some other opportunities out there now, and I think it puts us in both the Pan-African Unity Dialogue, because there were a number of people from the Pan-African Unity Dialogue who participated in various sessions, and including yourself. So it really positions the Pan-African Unity Dialogue as a both domestic and international entity. But overall, certainly the Institute of the Black World 21st Century as a good faith facilitator and convener has been elevated. And, I think it allows us to push forward now in a very effective way.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now, I asked you to come on as a guest because, being a part of the Pan-African Unity Dialogue and hearing the people that represent the Afro Caribbean, Afro Cuban community, and the death of Fidel Castro, and listening to what the narrative was on these main channels, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, on who Fidel Castro was, and then hearing the history of the struggle in apartheid and the struggle in the Afro Cuban and the Caribbean community, it's a difference in view of who Castro was. So I wanted you to come on from your point of view. Who was Fidel Castro, and what did Fidel Castro represent to Africans and African Americans and Afro Caribbeans?
Well, I think, and it's very interesting because if today, if Putin, for example, and I'm no great lover of Putin, but if Putin were to die today or make his transition, he certainly would not be. They would say that President Putin has died. They wouldn't say the dictator Putin would have died. You know what I mean? Nor the leader of China. China has a so-called communist socialist system where there are not Western-style elections. And by the way, where there is no, and where there's Tiananmen Square, one of the greatest massacres in recent memory was achieved on the crackdown of those students in Tiananmen Square. I mean, it was bloody, brutal.
Right.
There's no such thing in terms of Cuba, and yet, there is this narrative driven largely by the power and influence of the Cuban Americans who fled Cuba. And who have a powerful position in terms of their electoral strength, which, by the way, is important because elections matter, electoral power matters, and they have dominated it for many years, even though it's now declining. So I think the first thing we need to understand is what was Cuba like before Fidel Castro? Because there are many people in your listening audience, perhaps, who aren't aware of that. They just know of, because he was around for such a long time, 90 years old, since 1957, over a decade, over a half century. Cuba, prior to Fidel, was a U.S. playground. It was run by a vicious, brutal dictator who had very little interest in the masses of the Cuban people, particularly Afro-Cuban people, and Fulgencio Batista. And he was one of many dictators in the area supported by the United States. Trujillo over in the Dominican Republic, Duvalier in Haiti, Somoza in Nicaragua. I mean, these are all brutal, vicious dictators, who really were supported by U.S. capitalism, U.S. business interests, and they were playgrounds, particularly, well, not all of them, but Cuba was a playground. Meyer Lansky and the Mafia virtually ran much of Cuba. And you had widespread prostitution, you had tremendous amount of illiteracy, you had, a lot of poverty, and a lot of overt racism in terms of Afro-Cubans, because the Cuban population, by U.S. standards, is probably 70% black, if you were to use the litmus test, the test we use in this country. But by any measurement, clearly half of the Cuban population is black, concentrated, over in Oriente province and Santiago and whatever. So that was the situation that Fidel and the revolutionaries, and by the way, from a position of privilege. Fidel was, the son of privileged parents. He was eventually a lawyer. He was an intellectual. He was someone who saw in this system of oppression something that he felt was not just and fair, and rose up against it, was able to collect and create a united front, to defeat the forces of Batista, to establish a revolutionary regime. And that regime, of course, was the people who fled, by and large, were the privileged class. And most of them were light, bright, and damn near white. They were first of all, the light-skinned Euro-Hispanics who fled. In that first wave, there were no black people, because black people celebrated, because the black people were the base of the Cuban Revolution coming out of Santiago and Oriente province. And so the confiscation, yes, eventually of property that belonged to this ruling class that had no sympathy and no empathy for black people, had no empathy for the working class at all, who now is, moaning and begroaning its fate. And, I'm not belittling that at one level, because if you lose your family household or whatever, obviously that's painful. But on the other hand, it dismisses the pain and the oppression and repression that was being committed on the vast majority of the Cuban population.
Right.
As a result of the Cuban Revolution, they moved, to be a force within the third world, the non-aligned world, which of course irritated the United States because it saw under the Monroe Doctrine, the Caribbean and the whole of Central and South America was under the Monroe Doctrine. It was the lake of the U.S. It was under U.S. domination. So now all of a sudden, you have a government that's aligned with Russia, aligned to some degree with China and the Eastern Bloc, and also aligned with emerging countries in Africa and these developing nations. So that was a source of great irritation to the United States. But what they achieved is spectacular, because they provided something that we don't have in this country: universal health care. They wiped out illiteracy. They went on a campaign to wipe out illiteracy. Cuba has one of the most literate populations in the world. It has one of the best medical systems in the entire world. So free education, free health care, and an economic system that was based on a more equitable distribution of goods and services. Now, one of the issues was, of course, with the squeeze with the embargo on, it had some solid, heavy dependency on the Soviet Union, heavy dependency on the other blocs. It had a monoculture in terms of sugar, which was potentially a problem, because as sugar went, so went Cuba, some coffee, but there was a need for diversification. So its economy has always been somewhat of a challenge. But what Cuba has, it has tried to distribute on a relatively equitable basis. Mm-hmm. And so then beyond that, you had Cuba sending its doctors and engineers all over the world to help various nations build their countries, particularly in the third world. Doctors who went, and you see them, not walking around boasting, just doing out of a sense of civic duty, a sense of social responsibility. Going in and with little, and not being paid the same as these doctors and lawyers are, doctors in the West, out of a sense of commitment. And of course, yes, it was clear that there was a need, or a perceived need, to challenge imperialism and challenge capitalism. And most of the developing countries, if you look at the histories and background of Nehru, and if you look at Nasser in Egypt, you look at most of the African leaders, almost all of them were anti-imperialists. They were anti-capitalist. They were for a socialist regime. And so Castro, helped to export these ideas and to send people to support revolutions as well. Not the least of which was Che Guevara, who was eventually killed in Bolivia. But beyond that, and the most crucial thing for Africans in the world, at the request of the MPLA and the forces in Angola, they sent in 30,000 troops to back and support and train, back and support the MPLA forces battling the forces of South Africa. And in the now legendary battle of Cusé-Cartonel, the MPLA, backed by the Cuban forces, delivered a crushing defeat to the South African Defense Forces, repelled them, sent them back into South Africa, and that opened the door for the independence of Angola and eventually paved the way for the independence of South Africa. So you're talking about a tremendous, rich legacy of support for people of African descent. So that's why you have a difference of perspective. You know, most white people, you know, the mass media, the dictator, this and that. Now, are there things that could be improved in Cuba? Of course there could be. But on balance, when you look at, you know, where they've gone, and now, you know, is there, in a way, you know, you have a generation of people who didn't come up in the revolution, but who have been the beneficiaries of it. They have health care, they have education, but they don't necessarily have the goods, the commodities that you're seeing all on TV. So there is this appetite for consumer goods, which is kind of natural, if you will. So you'll see a little restlessness on the part of the young generation as they are trying to find ways and means of improving their material condition, which is a challenge that Cuba faces. But it's been strangled by this blockade. And, you know, of course, President Barack Obama, you know, took a bold step in saying, wait a minute, this has not worked. We need engagement, you know, and by the way, I mean, what has Cuba done? I mean, if you could have engagement with Vietnam, you fought a bloody war with Vietnam. You know, Vietnam eventually, you know, ended up being defeated, but nonetheless, you fought a bloody, thousands of U.S. troops killed in Vietnam. And yet now the United States has relationships with what? Vietnam. China, Tiananmen Square. You can't talk about dictatorship. You can't talk about arbitrariness or whatever. I mean, it has a system, you know, which I think on balance is a system that is, you know, a good system in many respects. But the reality is you can't ignore Tiananmen Square. You can't talk about political prisoners in Cuba and not talk about political prisoners, you know, in China. You see what I'm saying? Or in Vietnam. But there's this way in which this small island nation of 11 million people is castigated. And they're castigated primarily, again, because of the power, the receiving power, I might add, because there are many younger Cubans who are also getting past it in Little Havana. They're looking for a new kind. They want to turn the page. And I think the last thing I would say, it's remarkable that the United States was almost the only nation in this hemisphere that was not actively engaged with Cuba. Whether it was Mexico, whether it was Canada, all of the Central and South America. In fact, as one of our colleagues, James Early, made, he said one of the greatest contributions of the Cuban Revolution was to give people a sense of self-determination. Because you got to understand the big bad bear. It was Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Here was this imperialist nation up north saying, "I'll kick you." I mean, you know, you line up or else. And so for Cuba, this small nation, to stand up to this Goliath and defy it successfully gave heart and encouragement and inspiration to revolutionaries. And all of them were not necessarily socialists or communists. They just wanted to be sovereign. They wanted to be nationalists. They wanted to have their own countries. And so it gave heart to a whole lot of people and nations throughout the hemisphere. And so they continued to have relationships with Cuba. In fact, the United States was, in fact, isolated in the regard. And I predict, really, frankly, no matter what Trump is saying, it will be the business interests who eventually will kick aside the embargo because they want to do business. They know the communists and all that, human rights, they want to do some business. And that's what happened in Vietnam. Everybody was doing business in Vietnam. There was this ideological holding on to this communist, and the business people said, yeah, I understand that, but France is making money. England is making money. Right. Germany's making money. We want a piece of the pie, a piece of the action. And eventually they, therefore, recognize Vietnam and normalize relationships so aid and trade and commerce could take place that will really be disproportionately beneficial, frankly, to the capitalist class in this country.
Wow. You know, and I thank you for explaining that because, you know, when we get the narrative, you know, a lot of young people don't know the history, you know, and one thing, I was watching MSNBC and it was really funny because they had one of the ladies, you know, they had a reporter out in Cuba and she was talking to a group of high school students. There was a whole bunch of them. And basically one high school student said, the only thing that they will change is the internet so they could buy clothes. That was it. I mean, they wasn't upset about anything else. They just wanted the fashions. You know, they just wanted to be able to buy clothes. Make the internet more, I guess, accessible, so they could buy clothes. And then they
there is this. I have a theory about this. I don't see myself as such a great theoretician, but I see a basic pattern. At the beginning, people want freedom from hunger. They want freedom from poverty. They want freedom from disease. That's their first level of freedom.
Right.
Once that's achieved, then people began to look at the next level, and that is, you're in a world when you can't live in isolation. You see what people have everywhere else. There's no way of blocking that out. It ain't happening. And so you do then want to, the first generation can have the kind of revolutionary fervor where they'll make sacrifices. They'll go without. But the next generation coming behind, as conditions improve, they didn't experience the same kind of things, just like we have in this country. Mm-hmm. There are people who didn't experience the harsh realities of Jim Crow. They didn't have to go to the back of the bus or witness or experience the Freedom Rise or the Bloody Sunday. So it's a different kind of experience. This generation is the beneficiaries of it. So they will see things differently. And a part of it is an aspiration of how do we take this economy now? Even if we want to preserve the socialist principles, the challenge for Cuba is that how do we preserve these principles of relatively egalitarian distribution so you don't have the perversion that you frankly see in China, some of these places. I mean, China's supposed to be a socialist system, but you got millionaires and, it's perverse. I mean, it's really, it's like an aberration. Right. Cuba doesn't want that. They want to have a system where there's relative equality. And so they're trying to figure that out. How do you do that so that people can have the goods, can have improved housing and automobiles and clothing and whatever, right, but still do it in a way in which you preserve the principles of socialism. And the principles, frankly, of just egalitarian sharing so that you don't have, extremes of haves and have-nots. That's what they're working on. And, it may take time. And it's challenging, and you're in a situation where people don't want you to succeed. I mean, right, they don't want who wants an example of that. I mean, one of the things that was embarrassing to the United States is when Katrina struck, Cuba offered to send in people to help with the earthquake stuff, with the hurricane stuff, because they're good at that. The United States, of course, turned it down, but Cuba was serious. They could have sent some people up in here who could have helped, but that would have been an embarrassment. Just as, again, you got universal health care in Cuba, and you have in the United States, you got 20 million people who are on a system of health care, and yet there's probably another 10 or 15 million who still don't have health care in the United States of America. So that is one of the great triumphs. And if you look at illiteracy in the United States, real illiteracy is a problem. I mean, a nation that can elect Trump has got some illiteracy problems. But beyond that, there's the question of functional illiteracy. People who actually go to school but can't use it because they really have not learned to read and write well enough. You don't have that problem in Cuba. Everybody in Cuba is literate. They can read and write, and that's a fundamental basis for democracy and for development. And as I said before, they have health care. The missing ingredient is trying to now create a system that will meet more of their material desires. And that's a legitimate aspiration that the Cuban Revolution will have to address.
Now, Dr. Daniels, let me ask you a question. Now, how can they achieve that without battling the hands of capitalism?
Well, they're going to battle the hand of capitalism, but what they'll have to do is they'll set conditions. So if you want to invest in Cuba, you just can't. Usually what investment means is that you just come in and you have a free reign, or you get inducements. They're not doing that. They have, and particularly in the tourist industry, see, Cuba has some of the most attractive potential for tourism anywhere in the Caribbean.
Right.
In fact, one of the things that's going to develop is a strong kind of circuit between Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti, particularly. And the tragedy is this: the part of Haiti that got devastated was the part of Haiti that was going to benefit most from that kind of engagement. So what you have to do is very simple. Instead of allowing people to come in and have carte blanche, you negotiate the kind of things that we can negotiate in this country in terms of community development corporations. Mm-hmm. You say, okay, you can come in to Harlem, Target, but we need 45%, 49% ownership. or we want 50-50 in terms of ownership. And by the way, these are the rules of engagement in terms of how you can function. This is what you can do and what you can't do.
It's something we need in the city of Mount Vernon.
Well, we need.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, just across the board. I mean, this is this whole thing of seeing an empowerment zone in and of itself as economic development is nonsense. Because what you really do is you replace the indigenous businesses with these big giant stores, and it provides jobs, but jobs is not necessarily economic development. They're not the same. Economic development is when you have it may be interdependent, but you have structures that are nourishing and helping to build indigenous structures. So that's what Cuba is wanting to do. They've allowed now some licensing. They've allowed some restaurants, and they've been very cautious in trying to figure it out. How do you do this, and do it in a way that you also don't have one set of people, which is somewhat of a problem even now, where because they're dealing with the tourism industry, they're doing much better than people who are in another sector, if you understand what I'm saying. So they got to figure out a way to, if one sector is doing good, how do you get revenues from that sector and then transfer it over to another sector so that, again, people are still doing good work or doing decent jobs and getting and doing it on the basis of livable wages and benefits that allow them to lead a quality life. So one of the things that Raul Castro has done, Cuba has opened up. Cuba has made some changes, but they haven't been rapid. They have not been really, they've been careful because they don't want to undermine their own principles as they calibrate how do you keep the principles intact and still be able to see that the population grows. And I'm confident they'll do it, and that's why we need to support Cuba in that regard. And, at some point, I think even there'll be companies straining at the bit. It's just like with China. You don't go jumping over into China and setting no business. One of the early things you heard about when China opened up, oh, man, they got all these rules. That's right. They're saying you ain't coming up in here and functioning by your rules. You function by our rules.
Right.
And there's enough money to be made that you see Starbucks, McDonald's, they're all over and everything, but they're functioning by the Chinese rules. Well, the same thing will happen in Cuba. You will be able to go into Cuba eventually, and there are areas in which they will maybe make some trade-offs because they may need some agricultural goods and various other things, but they are going to define the rules. And that doesn't happen very often. In many of the African countries and so forth, where you have exploitation taking place,
right.
It's just the rule is buy off the ruling class, make sure they can line their pockets real well, and then you can have the land, you can have everything, which is a tragedy. Cuba is not willing to do that.
Well, maybe some of our black elected officials should take a lesson from how Cuba operates, when dealing with black communities.
Well, that's one of the things that Charles and Inez Barron has done, for example, over in East New York. They have insisted on the rules of engagement. See, unfortunately, and some of this is just a lack of training, a lack of education, a lack of you have to have an orientation. If you don't have an orientation that is a people-based orientation, you just want to be elected, and even if you want to just do good, but you have to do good from what perspective? How do you do good? What is the means and methodology? What is your guiding philosophy for doing good? If you don't have that, then you end up being manipulated by the system, and it's pretty easy after a while to be, get drunk with the power and the benefits, and then a little deal here, a little deal there. Then you end up, with your hands in the cookie jar, and then they get slapped, and then you say, "Oh God, the black white people did that, and how come I can't?" Well, no, we ain't elect you for that.
Right.
I mean, that was not the goal of the deal in the first place. So some of it is about that education. It's about having community development strategies, which is, by the way, one of the things that is encouraging by Roz Baraka and Newark. I mean, I think he has a similar kind of orientation of how do you set the rules of engagement. And, of course, we have adopted, Institute of the Black World has adopted, in the declaration you will see, we are adopting Newark as a model African city.
Great.
And we're going to be bringing in, people who are community developers and urban planners to work with the mayor to see how we aggregate resources from all over the world. You know, I mean, it's a good place maybe for Jay-Z and some of these people who have a ton of money to talk about how do you invest in Newark. Let's make Newark a model African city so that the population, you know, who are still stuck, you know, at the bottom can have living wages, can have great opportunities because both the public sector and the private sector is perking.
Right. Any questions? Now you done broke it down. Everybody's sitting there looking at me.
Well, at 7 o'clock, I had about 30 minutes, so I gotta get back into the battle. I gotta get back into the sweatshop, the IBW sweatshop.
Yes, sir.
Grind out this work.
Yeah, but you know, again, you know, we thank you calling. You know, giving some of your time. I know you're busy. You're a very busy man, and we really appreciate you, Dr. Ron.
Well, we appreciate so much what you do because it's visionary, it's courageous. And that's what we need in this period. We need people who have courage, you know, who are strong, and that's what, you know, Black Westchester represents. That's what Blacks in law enforcement represents. And we do want to give out to the audience because we want people to sign up for our newsletter. We really, really are going to be doing a lot of things, more activities in New York and this greater region. So we want people to be able to go to the website IBW21.org. That's IBW21.org. Sign up for the newsletter so that you'll be able to get information from us. And if people want to call, they can call 888-774-2921. That's 888-774-2921, and we'll get back to answer whatever questions you might have.
That's great. And thank you again. And you know, whatever message you want to just let us know. You can come on the show. You're welcome. Doors is open any time, Dr. Ron.
All right. Well, we appreciate it so much. I'll keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
sir.
you.
The one and only Dr. Ron Daniels.
And I wanted to close out. I wanted to send this to you. I'm going to send this to you, AJ. You know, there's a video that a lot of people probably, you know, when talking about Fidel Castro in Africa, and let's give Dr. Ron Daniels another round of applause. You know, definitely, you know, it's very important. I just sent it to you. Go to 6 minutes into the video, but
it's only 6 minutes long. It's only 6 minutes long.
Oh, then go in 3:39. I'm sorry.
It's 6:54.
Yeah, 3:39. Go to like 3:30. You know, it's great to be able to reach out to brothers like Dr. Ron Daniels and Ron Hampton and Preston Gilstrap, different brothers that's been in the struggle for decades. So when we hear something, when we hear something, we're able to reach back and get the proper information from people that have done the research. So let's just play this.
Zamora Machel and Agostino Neto.
Yeah, let's play this.
La invasión de Angola por tropas regulares.
Hold on, there's something else on.
All right, let's
keep talking.
We're just gonna play this video where, you know, you hear about everybody how bad Fidel was, but here is Nelson Mandela after he got out of jail, talking to Fidel. And if it's, you know, and we all talk about Nelson Mandela and we all know the history, but look at the love that this man is going to show for Fidel Castro, for what he's done for people in Africa. Are we ready?
Very nice to see you.
Están contentos de verlo.
Please sit down.
Están contentos. Por favor, tenga bien sentarse.
Please sit down.
Siéntese.
Now, one thing before we say anything.
Una cosa antes de hablar, nada.
Before we say anything.
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema,
you must tell me when you are coming to South
me
Africa.
tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
You say, no, just a moment.
No. Un momentito.
It's seguro, yo recibí.
The sooner the better.
And we have had a visit from a wide variety of
invitado
people.
una gran cantidad de personas.
And our friend Cuba,
Y nuestro amigo Cuba,
which helped us in training our people,
que nos ayudó a entrenar a nuestra gente,
gave us resources to
que
get
nos dio
on with our
recursos,
struggle,
que nos ayudaron tanto en nuestra
trained
lucha,
our people
que
as
entrenó a nuestros
doctors and so
combatientes, a
on.
nuestros médicos.
You have not come to our country.
Cuba no ha venido a visitarnos, usted no ha ido a visitar.
When are you coming?
¿Cuándo viene?
No he visitado a mi patria
I
surafricana.
haven't visited my South African homeland
La
yet.
quiero como una patria.
I love it as a
Quiero por él
homeland.
y por el pueblo.
I love it as a homeland as I love you and the South
When
African
are you
people.
coming to South
Pero
Africa?
¿cuándo viene Sudáfrica?
Creo que va a tener que ser hoy mismo. Va a
I
tener
think it
que
will have to be today. I will have to fly back with you.
No, you are very
Él
soon.
se va a las 10.
You are leaving at 10, so we are catching the plane together.
Soon afterwards, Fidel did go to South Africa and on his way stop off in Namibia, where he was greeted by Sam Nujoma, the nation's leader.
Welcome to the Republic of Namibia,
Bienvenido a la República de Namibia.
the country which you helped to liberate, to be liberated.
In South Africa, Mandela was waiting. Fidel was invited to address the South African Parliament.
Conviértase Sudáfrica en modelo de un mundo futuro más justo y más humano.
Let South Africa be a model of a more just and more humane future.
Si ustedes pueden, todos podemos.
If you can do it, we will all be able to do it.
Fidel is linked to the...
So, one man's tyrant is another man's revolutionary.